About 25% of Latvia's population is ethnic Russian. Among them are a few radicals who have controversial views. Some do not support the war. There are also those who increasingly feel Latvian. Still, in many places in Latvia, the first language is Russian. And many Latvians don't like that, so they're removing post-Soviet monuments and limiting the presence of the Russian language. According to Russia, Russian speakers are persecuted in Latvia. And among others, this man believes it to be true. The West is afraid that Russia will use the excuse of defending the minority to start a new war. The Russian line about defending minorities is very well known. Russia has used this excuse for war more than once and more than twice. Ukrainians, Georgians, and even us Poles know this. So are Russian speakers in Latvia being persecuted? Do they want Russia's help? How do Latvians justify the need to remove the Russian language from the public sphere? We talked about this with Latvian experts as well as representatives of the Russian minority in Latvia. In 1989, as many as 900,000 of Latvia's less than 2 million population were Russians. A popular myth is that Russians have always been here. However, this is not true. They made up 8% of Latvia's population, and only since the post-war era did that number drastically increase. But how did this happen? To understand how they came here, we need to go back more than 80 years. In June 1940, Soviet troops occupied Latvia. Shortly thereafter, they began something we know very well from Europe's history: deportations. First, the leaders of Latvian society, and then also ordinary farmers, were deported in tens of thousands deep into the Soviet Empire. After World War II, Latvia's industrialization began. Workers were needed, and they were brought in from various parts of the USSR, including Russia. Dr. Kārlis Dambitis of the Museum of Occupation of Latvia explains.
Approximately, we counted that in 40 years, in territory of Latvia, came here and lived here, not for every this period, but for some moments, approximately 2.2 million Soviet inhabitants from everywhere, from Russia, from Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. In large numbers, this amount of inhabitants who came in territory of Latvia was more like inhabitants Latvians here at that moment. This is also one of samples that, for example, this is doctoral thesis about Latvian language, about problem which is actually only in Latvian language. This thesis is in Russian, because if you want to defend your thesis, you need to write it in Russian. So Russian language was everywhere, and you even couldn't use sometimes in public Latvian language. There was problems about this.
Soviet citizens from other parts of the country, including Russia, were eager to come to Latvia.
So these living conditions in Baltic States was quite better than in Soviet states and other part of Soviet Union. So this was the reason why everyone wanted to live here in Baltic States. Jurmala, you know, it was one of the greatest places to be in the vacations in summer or near the Black Sea. But Jurmala was better because there was more close to Europe. So there was the feeling of modern Europe and modern world here in Baltic States.
Latvia was therefore an attractive place to be. This led many Red Army soldiers stationed in Latvia to choose to stay here for retirement. Some still live here today. Now, let's look at the numbers. According to a survey, there are 900,000 Russians in Latvia in 1989. Today, it's almost 446,000. However, the number of Russian speakers is higher. This is because, for example, Poles or Belarusians in Latvia's Latgale region mainly speak Russian. Sociologist Dr. Ieva Berziņa of the National Defense Academy of Latvia tells us more.
Lots of ethnic minorities. We have Russians, we have Ukrainians, we have Belarusians, we have Polish, we have Lithuanians, we have Estonians. The problem is, and this is largely consequence of Russian, actually Soviet colonial politics and Russification, and many of those minorities have lost their ethnic identities and they have been Russified, and that's a problem. So, strictly speaking, in Latvia you have around 25% ethnic Russians, but those who use Russian language as their native language or as their first language is around 37%.
After Latvia regained independence and the USSR collapsed, a problem arose. What to do with the country's Russian residents? Should they be deported? Should they become citizens of Latvia? Who should become a citizen? Would Russians influence Latvian politics? Should they become Latvian citizens just because they have lived in Latvia? These were the questions facing Latvian leaders. In the end, it was decided that only descendants of citizens of the Republic of Latvia from the interwar period could obtain citizenship. The descendants of Soviet colonialists were granted non-citizen status. This status entitled them to remain in the country, but did not provide political rights. Non-citizens could not vote or run for certain positions. They could obtain full citizenship on the condition that they passed exams on the knowledge of the state and the Latvian language. Some non-citizens took this route, but others, who did not want to learn Latvian, chose to accept citizenship of the Russian Federation.
This number of non-citizens has significantly decreased. It's now slightly more than 9%. It used to be much higher figure at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now it's 9%. And we can foresee that it will end because since 2020, Latvia changed legislation and all new babies that are born in Latvia, that they are automatically granted Latvian citizenship. So we can see that it is a problem that will go away with the time, so to speak, yeah.
The debate around the social situation, Russian-speaking rights, and the Latvian language has antagonized society almost since the country regained independence. On the one hand, most Latvians are seeking to strengthen the presence of the Latvian language in the public sphere, while the Russian-speaking minority would at least like to keep control over the changes made by the state. What is the importance of the Latvian language and what is its situation? We ask Latvian conservative poet, translator, and activist, Liana Langa. She's the author of the controversial De-Russify Latvia campaign.
We have our state because Latvians had Latvian language that defined them as Latvians, you know, and we cannot continue to compete with this big Russian language. So language is also the expression of political power, you know. If you hear Latvian language in institution, you understand that you are in Latvia, you know. If you go somewhere and there is Russian language all over, then what is it? It's Rus Latvia or something like that, because Latvian that is spoken by less than 2 million people, you know, in our not so big territory. We cannot compete with language spoken by approximately 200 million people, you know. And Russian language, because it's a very big nation, you know, it's naturally very aggressive, and Russian are much more aggressive than Latvians are. So they always push the language, and they are very much used to it, you know, and for us it's not acceptable. So a lot of people stopped talking Russian on everyday basis. You know? We just stopped talking, yes.
Not everyone agrees with such a stark position and course of the state policy. One such person is Olga Pietkiewicza. Olga is of Russian descent, and in her political activities, she focuses on defending Russian speakers.
No, everyone wants to live in peace. But what our authorities do is they make others think that we are supporting Putin and want him to come here. No, it's not like that. We want to live peacefully, and we agree that there's only one state language in Latvia. It is Latvian, and my generation, we speak Latvian, no problem. But let us speak Russian also freely in our private life. Let us listen Russian songs maybe somewhere in public. Let us have some Russian holidays and fasts. Why not? is there any trouble with that? I cannot understand this really.
Under the influence of the war, Latvian law was reformed in the fall of 2022. According to it, citizens of the Russian Federation living in Latvia are required to apply for the legalization of their residence. As part of this process, they would have to pass an exam on the basic knowledge of the Latvian language.
I think that these amendments to the immigration law are not fair because these are about 25,000 people who are affected by this. And the problem is, the greatest problem is that 83% of these people are aged 60 plus. These are old people, and this is the age when they, if you ask them what have you had for breakfast, they don't remember. And they are asked, they are pushed to go and pass a 2 hours long exam, which is an enormous stress for them. And when they realize that the result of this exam will define will they stay in their home or not, they don't remember anything from Latvian language at this moment because they are nervous, and it's just it's not fair to make old people do things like that, especially taking into consideration that they all passed language tests in 90s, and the documents they have allow them to work in Latvia nowadays, but do not allow them to live in Latvia. It's just nonsense.
It's worth mentioning here that this issue involves about 1,000 people who do not want to pass the Latvian language exam at an A2 level.
It's the ability to do the shopping in a store, to run a simple errand in a government office, and to understand a basic news article in Latvian. It's not the level necessary to deliver a university-level lecture or write a complicated academic article. This is really the minimum level needed for a person who has lived for more than half a year in this country and is not just a tourist. It's just the level required to survive and to function efficiently in society.
According to the law, it is indeed possible to deport those people who refuse to pass this exam. However, not once has such a procedure been initiated.
In the first half of 2024, over a dozen people received letters asking them to leave the country, while deportation procedures in the spring of 2024 have not yet started and are unlikely to begin. This is indicated by official political statements that these deportation procedures are so complicated that they are unlikely to start. Even the Minister of the Interior himself and the Director of the institution dealing with foreigners in Latvia have stated this.
This issue, however, contributes to a larger problem. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly claimed that Russian speakers in Latvia are being persecuted. In Latvia, we spoke with people of Russian descent. One of them is Olga Pietkiewicza. She's a representative of the Harmony Party. Her political opponents accuse the party of being pro-Russian. Another is Vlada Romanova, a documentary filmmaker and activist who describes her views as pro-Latvian and pro-European. We asked them if they felt discriminated.
I don't feel discriminated because I feel myself as a Latvian. My first language is Russian language, and but now I would say that I speak mostly in Latvian language because my friends are Latvians. When I have to do some business, professional stuff, so it's also in Latvian. And I know Latvian, it's like my work language. My boyfriend speaks Latvian, he's a Latvian. No, I don't feel discriminated. And also one more thing why I don't feel discriminated is about my opinion, because I would say that my opinion is very pro-Latvian opinion. I would say not pro-Latvian, but very pro-European opinion. And so that's why I feel very comfortable. I don't feel discriminated in Latvia. I have one friend from my past life, from my Daugavpils life, and he's my classmate. And I see what post does he publish on his Facebook. And all these posts are very, very, very pro-Russian, and also I would say that my father could be discriminated because I see which political parties does he support, and it's not the parties that I would like to support, and these not the parties that I would like to be and to exist in Latvia. So I would say that they can feel discriminated, but I don't contact to them. Like I don't communicate with people who feel discriminated in Latvia.
Yes, I do feel discriminated because the last 2 years it was something terrible happening in our society, because the authorities of Latvia are fighting against everything Russian. They are putting this collective responsibility for the war in Ukraine, for the Crimea, for everything Putin does on people who only speak Russian. It's the only thing that connects me to Russians in Russia. I have never been in this country in my life. I was born here. The only thing that makes me similar to them is the language I speak. However, when I come to Russia, if I come to Russia, they will spot me as a foreigner, because the Russian language I speak is a bit slightly different from the language they speak. And it's a very popular idea now in Latvia that Russian-speaking people living in Latvia are somehow supporting Russia and somehow supporting Putin, but it's not like that, especially when we speak about people of my generation. My parents, who lived most of their active life in the Soviet Union, of course it's slightly different for them. But people of my age are those who live now, who are economically and socially active now. We are those who raise children here. And in my opinion, it would be just more wise to look on us, not on those who were living in the USSR. And speaking about us, I can say that even before the war started, even before they made the decision that all the schools will teach only in Latvian, my friends living in Daugavpils, speaking Russian in their families, wanted to put their children to Latvian kindergartens. It was completely just their decision that they want this because they attribute them to this country. They want to stay for life here, and they just think that it would be better for their children to speak Latvian freely and to speak Russian at home freely also, and to just speak 2 languages. Why not? The more languages you know, the more rich you are. And yes, now it's completely different, and it's terrible because local media make news of the fact that someone put Russian song in the supermarket. Come on. Is it just a news of the Republican
level?
Yes, of the Republican level, because what's wrong with the Russian song? I love and listen to Latvian music, and I listen to Russian music, and it's okay. And the idea I want to make Latvian authorities here is that we are not Russian Russians. We are Latvian Russians, and we want to live in peace in this country. And we are not responsible for the things Russian president does in any way.
We asked political scientist Philip Rajevskis about the Latvian perspective on Putin's allegations of discrimination against Russian speakers in Latvia.
It's very interesting. I think it's again, he's talking to people who never been in Latvia, and they have even not been in western side of Russia, because what does it mean, the discrimination? They have political rights, they are represented in parliament, they have all social rights, they are citizens of the country, they have all benefits. I don't know what is this discrimination he is talking about. If he wants that Latvia has a second language as a Russian language, then I think it's absolutely normal that we can reciprocity principle. We want that Russia has a second Latvian language. In the 19th century, there was huge immigration of Latvians to Siberia, but this is not repressions. They immigrated to free lands. And even now there are places where there are populated by Latvians, and they're even speaking, they are singing Latvian songs, they're speaking Latvian. So I think we have right to ask that Duma part-time work in Latvian. It's normal. I think they are discriminating our nationals, Latvians, who are living in Russia, not to communicating with them in Latvian. So I am saying that Russia is discriminating our rights.
Sociologist Mārtiņš Kaprans of the University of Latvia told us about the sociological perspective.
Perceived discrimination is relatively high. It's still relatively high. I don't remember whether it has increased significantly after the war, but it was already before the war that there was much higher than supporting Russia in this war, that those who feel discriminated. But we have asked, actually, do you personally have faced with discrimination? In fact, that's smaller, as always. When you ask is there corruption in Latvia, everyone will say there is. But if you have personally faced or given bribe, then it declines immediately. But about whether there are actually discriminatory mechanisms or discriminatory conditions that could trigger this feeling. Most likely depends whom you ask. Yes, if you ask me, I would say there are, of course. But then again, the question is about the ethnopolitics in general. Latvia has, of course, opted for one language as a basis of uniting this nation. So it becomes immediately somehow, even if you do not have these intentions, it becomes discriminatory to some extent towards a large minority that do not have their language is not officially recognized as part of this of this nation. So it will become, and then the question is whether this feeling and sense of being discriminated is reproduced in the youngest generation. I wouldn't say so. I can see that it is decreasing, and not so easy to answer actually, because there are definitely things. For example, when you hear Atkrieviskojat Latviju, a lady you interviewed yesterday, I don't know if you feel the tension that is encoded in the phrase. That's a neologism in Latvia.
Unrussified Latvia.
Yeah, but in Latvian it sounds very sharp, very aggressive. I don't think you can convey the same emotional load in English. That is in this phrase atkrieviskot, because you can say, latviskot, which is the same, just Latvianized, not but you do the same, yes, but it doesn't have the same aggressive intentions that is in this verb atkrieviskot. And so when you hear this, and again, just kind of trying to imagine how really a loyal to the country a Russian speaker can feel when he keeps hearing, and it's kind of somehow also accumulating some kind of energy, this idea of everything should be atkrieviskot. So it becomes rather complicated to live in such conditions. And then when me as a sociologist ask, do you feel discriminated? I wouldn't be surprised that someone who maybe 3 years ago was in that I don't feel being attacked or being somehow stigmatized, now I feel after this.
O ile możemy powiedzieć, że w latach 90.
It can be said that in the 1990s, Latvian legislation was constructed to put people communicating in Russian, the descendants of Soviet immigrants, at a disadvantage socially, politically and economically. However, this is a matter of the past. Over these past 30 years, if someone wanted to integrate, become part of Latvian society and still use Russian on the street or at home, they could. All they had to do was meet a few requirements, which are not too difficult. Today, on this level, there is no systemic discrimination like there was in the 1990s. We have to say, however, that this systemic discrimination of the 1990s was necessary, because by the late 1980s and early 1990s, Latvians might have already been a minority in their own state, and there might not have been an independent Latvian state. They were about half of the country. Today, if I were to talk about discrimination, certainly some parts of the older generation feel discriminated against. But I would not say that it's systemic, real discrimination. It's not difficult to meet these conditions that have been liberalized over the last 10 to 30 years, and you can become a member of Latvian society, which to some extent is a less national, more political formation. These days it's not difficult.
And obviously Russia uses Russian language as a tool of influence. It is declared in its strategic documents that the spread of the Russian language, it is one of Russia's strategic aims and the way how it achieves its strategic aims. And what is specific about Latvia is that we, for 3 decades, we used to be our society were used to be audiences of Russian internal media, because those media were available, and of course people know the Russian language, and some of its content were interesting, appealing, but with it there also came Russian propaganda narratives. So what Russia was able to do for decades to promote its worldview. And yeah, and it's a specific worldview, and it has really, since it's a long-term issue, so the set of beliefs and the way how people see the world has established strongly.
Russian speakers are scattered throughout the country, but the majority live in Latgale, one of the regions of Latvia. Over 50% of people there are Russian speakers. In the region's capital, Daugavpils, that number is higher, up to about 70%. Russian is the primary language of communication. Even though, according to Latvian law, signs on service companies must be in Latvian, once you enter, the staff will most likely speak to you in Russian. Finding street signs in Russian is also not particularly difficult. You only have to go outside the city to see street names written in Cyrillic. Let's remember, this is prohibited by law, and not everyone likes the broad presence of the Russian language in the public sphere.
Would you feel comfortable, let's say, if you go into the store, you know, and 2 sales women are speaking Russian and you don't understand what they're speaking, you know? During this, when language law in Quebec, you know, was founded, store was a public space, working place was a public space, and Canadians were forbidden to speak English, because you know it's also the question of security. Because if I go into the store of my country, you know, I have a right to understand what salesmen or what are speaking, you know. A lot of young Latvians, they don't know Russian language, you know. So it's unacceptable. Like in German, you know, if you go into store, 2 Turkish salesmen will not speak Turkish language.
Olga Petkevicha has a different view.
We agree that there's only one state language in Latvia, it is Latvian, and my generation, we speak Latvian, no problem. But let us speak Russian also freely in our private life. Let us listen Russian songs maybe somewhere in public. Let us have some Russian holidays and fasts, why not? Is there any trouble with that? I cannot understand this really.
So there are still people in Latvia who do not want to learn Latvian and who have not integrated with the rest of society. This is footage from Latvian public television. It shows a protest of Russian speakers. One marginal group, the most extreme, speaks out in the video. Among them are people who directly accuse Latvia of fascism.
Почему задерживают?
Потому что они уроды, потому что они гадины, потому что они фашисты, потому что я их ненавижу. Я не могу жить в этой стране, потому что они фашисты, гадины, твари, и не понимают, где правда, а где ложь.
Although this is a marginal group, many still have not integrated with the rest of Latvian society. We asked Vlada Romanova about the reasons behind this.
I thought many times about this thing, and I don't understand this thing at all. I think that they doesn't feel that they live in Latvia, I would say, because I would say that all these people and all these people were born in the Soviet Union, and so Soviet Union, like the main country in Soviet Union was Russia, and Latvia is a neighbor of Russia. And if we are talking about the Latgale, if we are talking about the Daugavpils, so there was like many opportunities to choose like Russian media, to watch Russian media, and now we know that this was like propaganda media. And so I would say that that for all this time, for all these 30 years, they were still living in a Soviet Union, and they were still felt themselves as a part of Russia, and they were looking at Russia like as a father, like to a father. Yes, Matushka Rossiya. Yes, exactly. And for example, in Daugavpils, when I was a child, and when we were celebrating a New Year. So there was like Latvian president was speaking, and everyone was like, "Oh, who is that guy?" and after that or before that, I don't remember how this clock works. So the Russian president, like Putin, was talking, and we all were like standing and listening. And I remember that my grandmother said that, "Oh, he's so clever and he's so handsome." That's like a president of my heart, and I would say that. This is how it happens, yeah, for all these 30 years. So all these people are still living in their bubble, and that bubble, I would say, is like very bad post-Soviet bubble. And yeah, they still dream about Russia and their children. Also, okay. Not everyone, but I would say that very big amount of their children, because. So we learn everything, I would say, like all basics from our family. And if you go to your school, and in your school, like everything in Latvian language, and like your teachers are very like pro-Latvian, pro-European. And after that, you go to at home, and at home, like your father, he says, "Oh, Latvian sucks, and Latvia is like the worst country in the world." So of course, it's some kind of influence.
Now let's focus on the views of the Russian-speaking minority. What is their attitude towards the war in Ukraine?
Half of Russian speakers here do not support any side. That they are undecided. They don't want to support any side in this war, and so the one interpretation of that that would be more supported by Latvian, maybe most nationally minded people. But not necessarily very scholarly educated, maybe it would be that they all want to hide their true pro-Kremlin attitudes and views, yes, to the war, which is not true. I mean, you can ask any other very direct, ideologically loaded question, and you would see that many of these people actually do not hide their positions when it comes to the for example, reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine. Many of them actually will agree with many pro-Kremlin narratives, like there was no choice, that NATO was, all these pro-Kremlin stories and myths about this, why they were forced to. Then when you ask directly about which side do you support, there is this huge hesitation. And of course, not only because of that, many of them are still very much, cannot come to terms with the very fact that, they could approve the reasons, but that it has happened, they can't accept it, and they can't support any of these sides, therefore.
On the one hand, a large portion of Russian speakers is undecided. On the other hand, contrary to many fears, the number of people who support Putin outright is not big.
This war showed how small is the real Putin fan group in Latvia, to say that. Because everybody thought, oh, this will be 30% of people. Always Russian narrative was, there's 30% non-citizens. They will rise up. It will happen something big. There are so many. At the end of the day, there are less than around 5%. That's it. That's it. And they cut off all others who have different opinion. And this is that what we can see in reality. How big is the fan group of Russia? It's really much, much smaller than Russia tried to project all around when they're talking about Russian rights, minority rights. There's huge numbers of people. No, there no. Where? Figures are not sociology. Sociology doesn't show that.
Many Western media outlets portrayed the situation in Latgale in a terrible light. It was feared that in the event of an attack by Russia, many Russian speakers would collaborate. Such a scenario, however, seems unlikely.
That there is such a large group of hesitant Russophones. I said I don't think, because it's not easy to mobilize such a undecided and rather passive, maybe even not passive. Sometimes they are politically active, but they have so many competing motives in their identity that you can't do a fist, so to say, political fist. And therefore, it's not very, not so. And he said it's like he drew parallels with swamp. When you throw a bomb in the swamp, it sinks and does not explode in a way that, because it's it goes somehow all deep inside, and because it's like a very swampy, so to say. If I take this analogy, swampy situation that you can't simply explode what is not explodable, maybe. That's
from the amount of people from Latgale who joined National Guard from 2022, from the beginning of the war. National Guard in Latgale has a big kick in development, and people join National Guard. It shows their behavior. I think they are ready to fight. Nobody joins the National Guard if they're not ready to fight. So I'm rather sure that this is again a narrative which is much promoted by Russia to make us less stable, to make us more worrying about internal issues, not thinking about our support to Ukraine and about our security in broader sense of word.
The Western media also talked about Latgale, saying that pro-Russian separatist movements could arise there, as they did, for example, in Crimea.
No, no, such things are not happening in Latvia, and these ideas that kind of some separatist ideas, this has been a matter of discussion since 2014, when Russia used the hybrid tactics to annex Crimea. But you can't speak of such moments in Latvia, and basically it's illegal. It's against Latvia's statehood. So our security services are doing their job. But that's one side of the story. But also it's not very popular. Also among a Russian-speaking audience. Because what I'm doing in my research work, I'm talking to young people a lot. And I was doing a study 2 years ago, and I'm also doing a study now, and many of young Russian speakers say to me that they have no connection whatsoever to Russia. They have nothing in common with that. So no, it's a huge exaggeration.
Russian-speaking Latvians or Latvian Russians are unlikely to want to be rescued by Vladimir Putin. They do not expect an invasion by Russia, the protection of their supposed or real rights by Russia. This is indicated by most sociological studies, and also by public sentiment and the fact that, increasingly, younger generations of Russian-speaking residents of Latvia do not know Russia, in the sense that they have never been there. Their impressions come from the stories of their grandmothers, stories of what life was like in the Soviet Union. There is also probably a generation that still watched Russian television. On the other hand, the standard of living, the quality of life here in Latvia, the opportunities that Latvia offers mean that despite some disputes with the Latvian majority, these disputes are settled within the internal political system and internal socio-political life and are not escalated internationally.
Regardless of what the Russian-speaking Latvians want, Russia is taking advantage of their problems. And many fear that in the future, Putin may use this situation as an excuse, as was the case with Ukraine.
There will always be someone here in Latvia who is radicalized, frustrated, who is socially and economically marginalized, but these are isolated cases. Someone says they would be happy for Russia to intervene. They even make an appearance in the Russian media to do so. But it would be a made-up argument. Russia is ready to create narratives about the need to intervene for the sake of minority rights throughout Central and Eastern Europe, even where the minority is politically insignificant and its rights are not being violated, where there is not and never has been a conflict over these rights. This argument is false, and Russia is capable of blowing it up to the point where it will appear to be true in the media. The only question is whether societies in the West, who are not familiar with the local context in other European countries, will take this Russian propaganda and this Russian narrative as true and conclude that, well, there really was such a problem and Russia has the right to intervene. Russia never has the right to intervene, because relations between minorities and the states to which these minorities belong should be resolved in a democratic manner, as is often the case in Central European countries. The issue of national minorities or ethnic groups living in these countries that are not the nation in the country's name are resolved at the diplomatic level, at the level of the rule of law, at the level of debates between the governments of these countries. Civilized, democratic debates, not fear, not threats, not military political intervention.
So could Latvia be next? Will Vladimir Putin take advantage of the situation in Latvia and attack using the excuse of defending minorities?
Media zastanawiają się, czy państwa bałtyckie, w tym Łotwa, jest...
The media is wondering if the Baltic States, including Latvia, is next on the list of countries that Russia will attack. I would say this depends on the Ukrainians. If the war in Ukraine ends badly for Russia and the Ukrainians defend their state, and the Russian imperial project ends, then Latvians, Estonians and Lithuanians have nothing to worry about. If the ongoing war in Ukraine ends badly for the Ukrainians, or if it ends in some rotten peace deal, that's when Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians should start worrying. The appetite of Russian imperialism will not be satisfied by a semi-victorious war in Ukraine, and Russia will want to subjugate more countries it controlled in the past. Therefore, a common opinion in Latvia is that the security of Latvia and the other two Baltic states is de facto being defended by Ukraine, and it will be the Ukrainians on the front line who will decide whether Latvia is next.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, take a look at our other long-form videos right here.